go. Let's kick us off here.
Penalty.
It's all over every time. Pentateuch. All right. What's the first book in the Pentateuch?
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
All right. Very good. Next section.
The rest is everybody else's.
What's that?
I said the rest is.
No, I thought I heard somebody say the answer.
So I need to say it louder.
All right.
Joshua, Judges.
First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and
Esther.
Esther. That's it.
There you go.
My favorite book of the Bible.
All right.
Like, it just was playing.
Next section.
Wisdom.
All right.
Job.
Psalms,
Proverbs. Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon,
All right. Next section.
Major Prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel.
All right. Next section.
Minor Prophets,
All right.
Joel.
Hosea,
And then Joel.
Amos, Obadiah,
Joel.
Nahum, Micah, Nahum. Get those two backwards. Habakkuk, Zephaniah,
Haggai.
Zechariah, Malachi.
Very good. All right. In between section.
Intertestamental period.
All right.
Apocrypha, pseudepigrapha. Apocrypha is hidden writings. Pseudepigrapha is the false writings.
All right. Very good. What's the next section?
The New Testament, the Gospels,
All right.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
All right.
New Testament history, which is Acts.
All right. Next section.
Paul's letters,
Yep.
Romans. Somebody else talk.
First and Second Chronicles.
Corinthians.
Corinthians.
Yeah. I know what you meant. Nancy.
Yeah. Start with
I
C.
know what you meant.
Galatians.
All right.
That's going into the prison.
Subsection is the prison epistles. Very good. And I heard somebody say it.
Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians.
All right. And then there's what comes after Colossians.
First and Second Thessalonians.
There you go. All right. And then what's another subsection?
Pastoral.
All right. Pastoral epistles.
First and Second Timothy.
All right. And Titus. Yep. And what's that little one? Yep. And that finishes out the prison epistles. All right. So now today we are starting a new section. All right. And this one is called the General Epistles, which it's kind of self-explanatory. They generally don't necessarily address any certain church or group. So that's why they're called the General Epistles. Much like the other ones, it was clear that they were written to someone or for a church or one particular thing. This one's a little different. All right, so what is the first book in the General Epistles? Hebrews. All right. There's a joke or something about the guy making tea
And making.
Coffee, Hebrews.
Yeah.
Hebrews.
Yeah, the husband's supposed to do the coffee in the morning because he brews.
That's right. There you go.
Biblical. Bible tells it to.
All right. So as we talk about the book of Hebrews, what we're going to do today is we're going to do this in two parts because Hebrews is general. It's a lot longer than the rest of the general epistles, and there's so much content in it that is important to understand. Primarily today, we will just cover authorship and the background and probably the key themes, and we'll get into the key verses and some other things next Wednesday. So for today, what we want to talk about is the authorship. It is unknown. Now, I gave you a paper, and we're not going to go through. We're not going to go through that. It's something that I would like you to read because you can see that it's several pages long. It has some arguments for and against different people who may have wrote it, or people had ideas of who may have wrote it, and there's different points listed in each category for and against that person. And so you can read that at your own leisure. But predominantly, and most scholarly consensus over 2,000 years is that nobody really knows. And it's really one of the books. There are other books that we've already covered where people don't necessarily know who wrote it, but there's more evidence to suggest maybe it leans towards this person writing it than the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is just, it is a special book in and of itself. To me, I think it is a book that really needs to be, a deep study should be done on the book of Hebrews, just because of just all the Old Testament references, and to the tabernacle, the sacrifices, the rituals, all of those things. You really need to have a good background in those things to kind of put together with what the author is trying to say and allude to in this letter. And this is, even though this is put into the section of General Epistles, it is not really a letter. It's more of a sermon because of the way it's written out, the way that the way that the dialect goes throughout the whole thing. It reads like a sermon. It doesn't read like most other books that we have read, and so we'll talk a little bit about that too.
It took me a while to get into it because it doesn't read like the others. But I heard somewhere that Paul may have had a hand in it too, and the last part of it kind of sounded like Paul. But the first part is like, who in the world?
Well, we're Paul is, if let's say there's scholarly consensus that nobody knows who wrote it.
Right.
There's also scholarly consensus that if they did have an idea or a guess of who wrote it, they lean towards Paul or not Paul. And so that's where you find
well, it's
more.
kind of like, yes, some of it sounds like Paul.
So that's
some
more of where you really find. You can get into the argument of, okay, well, Paul, even though we don't know who wrote it, Paul might be my first choice, so let's talk about Paul and write about that. And so a lot of scholars do talk about the reasons for and against Paul, and the reason that he's kind of the number one choice is the reason I didn't mention all the other ones that you have a list on. You can read those for yourself and come to your own conclusions. That was something that was given to us when I was at John Wesley. And I thought it was good information for anybody who would go into studying the book of Hebrews, just to understand, some of these different things. But we're going to talk about Paul. I'm going to give you some reasons, and some of them may be a little bit different. Some of them may be the same of what you got on there. But we're going to go through these so that you can kind of get an idea of where this argument is and why. It's not one of those things that it's not a salvation issue. So you can have your opinion. You can draw your own conclusions. But I feel like for the study, at least of this book, I think we need to cover it, just so you'll have an understanding that, at some point, if you're ever deciding that you do want to do a deeper study of this, you'll at least have some information to say, okay, well, this is how I think or how I draw my conclusions. So first what we're going to do is we're going to talk about evidence that Paul did not write Hebrews. Evidence that he did not write the book of Hebrews. Probably one of the number one reasons is that people will say that Paul did not write the book of Hebrews is the style of Greek that was used in writing the book of Hebrews. Now, when I say that, there were a couple of different types of Greek. What you will find in the New Testament is more of your general, everyday, common use Greek, which is called Koine Greek. I think it's spelled Koine, if I'm not mistaken. If y'all find it somewhere and I spelled it wrong, you're welcome to admonish me, because I'm going off poor memory. But it's that's like I said, that's more your general, everyday, common man's Greek. I guess you could say it would be like our common, everyday English. Some of us don't speak it too good, but we can get through a conversation. The way that the Greek in this book, or this letter, sermon, whatever, was written is written in a classical Greek. It is very sophisticated. It is very polished, which would be more like it would be more like listening to someone who is a very polished academic. I would say maybe someone, if you've ever heard Jordan Peterson, any of his speeches, he has a very polished and sophisticated English. And generally stuff he says you can understand, but every now and then he'll throw one of them 50-cent words in there, where we use nickel and dime words. Anyway, that's kind of the comparison that I would use as far as the types of Greek. And so Paul, typically when he would write his letters, he didn't use this polished, sophisticated type of the classical Greek language. He used more of the Koine Greek language. And so that's one of the things where people say, okay, Paul wrote, we know that Paul wrote, or have a good idea that Paul wrote all of these other letters. Why all of a sudden did he change? Why did he change his style of writing? It wasn't because Paul wasn't smart. He was smart before he ever started writing any of these things. So, I guess it is a possibility that he could have wrote it in that classical Greek form. I don't know. None of us really know, but that's one of the arguments against his writing of it, is just the style that the book was written in. There are certain things, certain types of Hebrew type language in the book of Hebrews itself, or terms, clauses, that differs a little bit from how Paul used some of those in all of his other letters. So, so why did Paul use them this way in this letter, and then all of a sudden he's using them this way in this letter? So, that's another reason why, and there's a lot of examples, so I'm not going to go through all those, but that's just another example. Another reason is the lack of Paul's customary salutation. Now, every single letter that we went through prior, since we started getting into from the book of Rollins all the way through all of Paul's other letters, there's been one thing that has been common throughout every single one of them, and is that they are all written like letters. Introduction, body, conclusion. Every single one of them.
Who was he
I,
writing?
Paul.
Huh?
I, Paul, a servant of Christ.
Yeah.
Starts them all up that way.
Yeah. And he only identifies himself.
Who was his audience? Who was he writing it to? The Hebrews?
We will
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
Well, I thought that might help determine why he would have.
Well, that
changed
is
his mind.
part of his audience, that's where we get the title, the Book of Hebrews.
Hebrews, right, yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
just
we'll
thought
talk
maybe-
about that when we get to the
I mean, since he
background.
was so smart, he probably knew the other Greek also, and because of his audience, that's the way they would need to be hearing it. In that class is a higher form of Greek.
Well, we'll get to that. We'll get
Okay.
to that.
I'm always jumping in.
We'll get to that. No, that's good, that means you're thinking. I like that, I like that.
Well, this book, it really was harder for me to read than some of
It
these.
is.
Okay,
And-
so it wasn't just me,
No, and I will say this, that there were times that I had trouble with it simply because at the time, whenever I would read it, I wasn't putting together the Old Testament references and the study behind them that I needed to. So once you do that, there are things that make a lot more sense.
okay, that's
And,
probably where I'm
and
at.
maybe that's, if y'all want to do that sometime down the road, do a deep dive on Hebrews, we can do that.
I think that'd be a wonderful idea.
It's well worth it. It's a great book to dive into.
Put that on the list,
Along with all the other ones.
along with all the others, right?
But that's another thing, that the way that the letter is written, it's written not in a letter form, but in a sermon form, differs from all of Paul's letters. So that's another argument against why he didn't write it.
Was this when he was in prison, or just before he died, or was Rick mind jumping at the gun again?
A little bit, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, we're
I'll
gonna
forget
cover
my
that.
questions then.
We're gonna cover that. We'll write the question down, because if I don't bring it back up, then remind me. And you better remind me, because I'll forget. Now, this is not my opinion, this is other people's opinion, so, that's the reason I'm telling you this. One argument against Paul writing the book of Hebrews is the writer of Hebrews apparently did not know Hebrew and quoted exclusively from the Septuagint. Now, do you remember what the Septuagint is? You know what it is, Barbara.
I know, and I get my brains. I think I got this other stuff before you did.
Translation of the Bible.
There you go. It's the Greek it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew. So that's the Septuagint. And so that was for a lot. See, again, here's something you have to understand about that day and age. Greek was the common man's language in that day. Even though Rome was a superpower, Rome was the world power, and Latin was their language, Greek was the preferred language of the entire known world at the time, because it was a easier language to learn, and it was the language of business. Now for the Jews, Hebrew and Aramaic was the religious language that they used. Greek was business language, and Latin was the language of the law. So that's something you can allude to whenever it talks about the sign being placed above Jesus' cross above his head. It was written in Latin, and Greek, and Hebrew. Well, you got the language of the law, you got the common man's language, and you've got the religious language. And so those are things that you always need to keep in mind that are going on during the first century.
Was that so, did they do it like that so everybody would know?
Well, see, the Septuagint was written around the middle of the 3rd century BC, around 200. It's estimates there 230 to somewhere between 260 BC of when the Septuagint was written, because there was such a heavy Greek-speaking Jewish population, and so they didn't necessarily know Hebrew or Aramaic, but they knew Greek, and so they wanted a version that they could read and understand more readily. And so it was commissioned in Alexandria, Egypt, under that power at the time, that kingdom, that they took 70, which is what Septuagint means. It means the 70. They took that many Hebrew scholars and translated the Hebrew that they had into the Greek language. And so that was a way for Greek-speaking Jews to be able to read the Old Testament. Does that make sense? So, again, in the New Testament, there are several times, and I've mentioned this before, that as you're reading the New Testament, and you'll see, Jesus did this several times, but whenever, there was a lot of times where Jesus quoted an Old Testament prophet. Now, if you read, if you go back and you look at who he was quoting, and most of your Bibles are reference Bibles, and so it'll give you a reference of who he's quoting and where it's quoted from. You go back and you read it in the Old Testament, what you'll notice is that it reads the same, but it's a little different. There might be a couple words switched around, or it might say something a little different, but it means the same thing. It doesn't change the meaning whatsoever. The reason for that is because either whoever was writing down, recording that gospel, or whether Jesus himself quoted from the Septuagint. That's why it reads different in the New Testament, and then we'll go and cross-reference it in the Old Testament because it's reading from the Septuagint instead of the regular Hebrew translation. So that's why you'll find some of those disparities. But don't despair, because they're still accurate, so don't worry about that.
That's what, like, people say the Bible contradicts it, so like, no, it don't. You just got to put it in context. You got to know what each thing represents.
Well, and that's an argument that people will use. It's simply because, they don't do any due diligence and study the Bible, which is what people ought to do, because the Bible tells us it ought to study the Bible. So when people don't study the Bible, say, well, all of a sudden I'm a Bible scholar now, even though I don't read it or study it. They point out these, what they call errors or discrepancies, without understanding any background, any of the language barriers or difficulties, the things that happen in translating, the old scrolls. They don't understand any of this. And so it really makes more sense when we say, okay, well, why does this not match up with this? Well, this is because that was translated into the Greek, and that's what he's quoting from. He's translating from a different language. It's still the same today. There are words that we use in English that they don't use in other parts of the world, and it means the same thing. Language is different across the board. There's nothing that's unanimous. Now, I think God did something about that at the Tower of Babel, didn't he? So, it don't take much. It just, a lot of their arguments are pretty weak arguments if you really get into it. They may sound strong on the surface, but if you do just a little bit of due diligence and study, you can pick apart their arguments and show them the correct way.
Was the Dead Sea Scrolls written in Greek?
No, they were written in Hebrew. They were written in Hebrew.
Hebrew?
Yes. Now, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the King James was translated from Latin translations that were translated from Hebrew and Greek. And you did have some Hebrew scrolls, but they had already been copied over, and they were, some of the oldest ones were about, 1000 AD. That's what they were translating from. So when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, then they were able to translate things that were written a lot closer to the time that they would have actually happened. So that's why they're considered much more accurate.
What stage of the Bible were the Dead Sea Scrolls written?
During the intertestamental period, a lot of them. That's what they're dated. They're dated around that time. There's some of them that could be dated a little prior to that, but most of them they seem to have dated around that time period. so you're looking at between 400 BC and 1 BC. But most of them would have been written, even prior, I know one of the more common dates that is thrown around is 200 BC for those. So when you take an ancient document that is dated to 200 BC, and you've been translating from another document that reads the same, there really is no difference in it whatsoever, and it's dated from 1000 AD, which one are you going to translate from to get you closer to the original? The one that was written in 1000 AD or the one that was written in 200 BC? Well, the one in 200 BC, because that's close to the time when these people actually did this stuff.
Well, Tower of Babel was not far from the Dead Sea, was it? Or Jericho? In that vicinity.
Well, there's different discussions or different ideas about where it may have been located. Because there's been a lot of natural disasters between now and then, and rivers have been rerouted. Landscape has changed dramatically. And that's another aspect you've got to keep in mind when you're trying to locate something. And sometimes us archaeologists have had a hard time locating things because that city might be in a different part of the area. Like one instance is the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. It's believed that it used to be even farther north. The shores did like several miles farther north than what it is now. But because it runs right through the Rift Valley, which is a huge fault line, and so that place is prone to volcanic eruptions, through areas that lie within it. Also, a lot of earthquakes. And so when you understand that during that time period, you understand why sometimes things aren't found exactly where they thought they might be, is because they've moved. The landscape has moved.
I have heard that the original Jericho, city of Jericho, was on the opposite side of Jordan.
Yeah. See, I want to say that Jericho, the last time that we find Jericho, that was the third time maybe it had been moved or built. And so that makes a difference whenever you start reading prior to Joshua's conquest, and you start reading some of that makes a difference. All right. All right, so another case against Paul not writing this is that the author of Hebrews introduces his quotations of Old Testament scripture in a different manner from what Paul normally uses. So again, when you look at the other 14 or 15 letters that Paul has previously written, and he quotes a lot of Old Testament, why would he all of a sudden change how he introduces the Old Testament scriptures the way that he normally does? So if he wrote this, then he completely changed his thought process, his writing style, and his vocabulary. Normally writers, I know one of my English teachers when I was at John Wesley, I hated English. I did not like being in that class. If I could have skipped it, I would. But I had to take two semesters of English, and I did have a great teacher. But she said that after reading a couple of assignments that I had to write, she said, I can read your assignment and I know that it's you without having your name on it. And she said, the reason I know that is because you write like you talk.
The misspelling, the grammatical errors.
maybe a 95 and a 97 in there respectively. So for someone who that's their most hated subject, I give credit to my teacher. She was a very good professor, and I appreciate her instruction. But she's right. So, in thinking about other people, there are people who you can list quotes, and without putting a name to it, and you say, well, that sounds like something so-and-so would say. And people who study these ancient authors or these ancient works, people who study poetry, anything written during a certain time period, also like with like the Civil War during that era, people who wrote extensively through those times. Someone who studies those things and studies the way that they're written and the authors, they could read something written by one of those authors without knowing who the author is and say, that sounds like so-and-so. And so here, this is another case of where, okay, well, this doesn't sound like Paul. This is something completely different. So that's something I can understand. We can do that today and relate that fact. Another thing here that is evidence against Paul's writing is that Paul's common use of compound titles to refer to the Son of God is not followed in Hebrews. And so, I guess one of those things is if you look at the different titles that he uses for Jesus in all of his other letters, and then compare them with what is used in Hebrews, again, it's something that's different. So this writer doesn't use the compound titles that Paul uses in the other letters. Another piece of evidence that says that Paul did not write this is that again, this is not my opinion, but it says that Paul's writings had very little to say about the present work of Jesus. Now, I don't know if I entirely agree with that, because I think that's just a matter of opinion. I think if you look at you look at any of his letters, I think you can find where he speaks on those issues, but I can see where they're coming from. Because in most cases, Paul is dealing with problems in a church. So he's trying to address the issues that come from Jesus' teachings. And so it may not leave a lot of room for the present work that Jesus is doing. But I think you can make an argument that you can explain Jesus' teachings and still have the idea of, all right, this is still presently working. This is what Jesus is presently doing. So I think you could probably read that into Paul's letters. But like I said, somebody else came up with this opinion, not me. But I can see where they get it from. Now this one here, this last one. Now this one I 100% agree with, because you can see this as clear as day. And we have talked about this before, especially when we read the book of Romans. Paul tends to give doctrine first and then give practical application in the second half of the letter. Whereas in the book of Hebrews, the writer alternates between doctrine and exhortation throughout. So that means it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth throughout the sermon, instead of one part being about doctrine and the second part being about application. Now, we did talk a lot about that when we covered the book of Romans, because that's really how you read Romans. Chapters 1 through 8, doctrine. Chapters 9 through 16, application. And so, even you look at Paul's other letters, you can typically find that same, it might be a little bit more lopsided, it may not be half the book, but you can still find that he addresses doctrinal things early in the letter and then adds practical application when he gets done with that. So I can see that point very, very clearly. Barbara, as you were reading through Hebrews, did you see any continuity there as far as that, being this is one thing and that's that?
At the first, I was like, okay, I'm just not getting this.
It's a lot of back and
At the end, it was
forth.
like all of a sudden it just came together.
Yeah.
And I feel like I need to go back and redo it. I did it slowly because it was.
Reading through Leviticus and the Tabernacle, you don't have to read all of Leviticus.
Yeah, because so much is repeated.
Yeah,
But it's still.
but if you well, you can even go back into Exodus and read about the tabernacle there, and then in Leviticus where it talks extensively about the tabernacle. That would be good background for you to read while you're studying Hebrews, because because the book of Hebrews does refer back to that a lot.
Yeah.
And it also refers back to Genesis quite a bit too.
I could see Leviticus throughout as I was reading, because that was one book that I just kind of laughed at as I was reading through it.
All right, so now let's talk about some evidence that Paul did write this letter. All right, so the first thing that we come across is that it is a scholarly opinion that the author was in prison while maybe writing this.
That's kind of what I thought.
And Paul suffered many imprisonments, so we know that. So there is a commonality of maybe some internal evidence that this was written from a prison cell or at some sort of prison.
Do you feel the pain when you're reading this?
Huh?
Do you feel the pain
I
of
used
a
to.
person? I did.
Yeah.
And you could really
Yeah.
see the pain that he was going through. And
Yeah,
that's what
and-
made me, that's why it seemed
Yeah.
that Paul could do it, especially the latter part.
Yep. Now there are another point of evidence here, and this one has kind of subpoints, so you just have to bear with me. But there are several doctrinal things that exist between Hebrews and Paul's writings. So we'll cover a few of those so that you'll understand what they are. I'll try not to go too fast. If I need to repeat one, just tell me. But some similarities in doctrinal things that Paul writes about that we find in Hebrews is the preeminence of Christ. So that's something that Paul talked about extensively in his letters, but is also very much talked about in this letter. And it's right off the bat, right in Hebrews chapter 1, it gets right into the preeminence of Christ. Now, something very interesting is that if you read John chapter 1, you find something very similar, because it talks about some of the same things about the preeminence of Christ. So I'm not saying that John wrote this by any means. John did have a very polished Greek. The Gospel of John was the most sophisticated of the Gospels. But Luke, in writing the book of Luke, he had a very sophisticated and polished Greek. More sophisticated and polished than anybody else. So on that paper you got, there's some arguments that Luke may have written this as well. Now Luke would have, since Luke was a Greek himself and was very educated, then more than likely he would have known the classical Greek. But where you get into some muddy waters with him is his knowledge of the Old Testament. And so that's something this writer knew the Old Testament. So that's there's not a lot of evidence in favor of Luke. There's a few things that favor certain people, but there's more evidence that surmounts against them. Another thing about some of the doctrinal similarities, the authentication of the apostles who have been given divine gifts and were able to perform miracles. Those are things that Paul had talked about that we also find here. Another Another common doctrinal theme that we find throughout Paul's letters in this is the humiliation of Christ. That he humbled himself and suffered humiliation for us. So again, Paul writes that, and that we find that in the book of Hebrews. Another doctrinal similarity is the fact that Paul used Israel's wanderings as examples of faith. That is also present in the book of Hebrews. Now remember, we're still on the subpoints of the doctrinal similarities. There's a couple more. Another thing that is very similar between Paul's letters doctrinally and this one, the book of Hebrews, is the temporary nature of the Old Covenant. You know that Paul does talk a lot about that. The book of Rollins especially. He also talks about it very much in the book of Galatians, as well as other books. Another doctrinal point of emphasis of similarity is the emphasis of faith of the people. So again, you know, addressed quite a bit in Paul's letters, and definitely in the book of Hebrews. I mean, there's an entire chapter dedicated to the work of faith. All right, so here's a third point third piece of evidence that Paul may have written the book of Hebrews. Now, you've heard me talk about who Paul trained under when he was coming up receiving his training. He was tutored by the foremost rabbi in that generation, Gamaliel. And I will spell that. It is G-A-M-A. G-A-M-A. What else? I said it's G-A-M-A. G-A-M-A.
What you said.
Okay, L-I-E-L. I just want to make sure. G-A-M-A-L-I-E-L. Gamaliel. All right, so we know that he was foremost rabbi. We have historical Jewish writings to verify that he was a real person. We also know that he shows up in the book of Acts. Remember, he was one of those, as I think it was Peter and John. It was there close. I want to say maybe Acts chapter 4, somewhere in there. I know it's close to that, but I think it was when Peter and John may have been in prison, and they had to go before the council and before the Sanhedrin, which Gamaliel was a part of, and he stood up and he said, we need to be cautious. He said, because we've had uprisings of people before who were claiming to be, doing the work of God or being the Messiah. And he said, they have been struck down. He said, but if these men are of God and God has sent them, and they are under the work of the Messiah, then there is nothing that you can do to stop them. Now, to me, that was a man of great discernment, and that was who trained Paul. But the fact that he trained under Gamaliel, then that means that Paul would have had extensive knowledge of all of the Old Testament rituals, the traditions, the sacrificial stuff that they did. He would have had extensive knowledge of all of that, because remember, Paul was a Pharisee. And so who were the religious leaders? The Pharisees. So we know Paul was a Pharisee.
And that's evident throughout Hebrews too.
Yes. So, the fact that this person had an intimate knowledge of all the Old Testament rituals, the sacrificial rituals and tradition, as well as the Old Testament scriptures themselves, we know that they were very astute to the Old Testament. Now, the fact that whoever, Paul, one of the things about being a Pharisee is that you had to know the languages. So Paul would have had to have known Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So he, a Pharisee would have had to have known all of those. And so we know that Paul knew all of those. And so the fact that Paul was a Jew, he trained as a Jew, he lived as a Jew, he was a Pharisee. This goes back to the point, okay, well, if he was writing to a group of Jewish people, a group of Hebrews, then why did he not just write it in Hebrew? Why did he use the Septuagint version of the Old Testament? There was no reason for Paul to use the Septuagint. Because in the synagogues, from what my understanding, they used the Hebrew scriptures. So why would Paul use something that is not used outside of the synagogues or the temple? Now that could have to do something with his audience. Now, it says that the book of Hebrews is because that's part of the audience. He was writing to an audience of Jews, the Hebrews. And so if he's writing to a Jewish community, then you would expect them to know Hebrew. But if this was a Greek-speaking population of Jews outside of Jerusalem, then perhaps maybe that's, if Paul did write this or the writer did, that's why they used this, the Septuagint instead of the actual Hebrew. So when you get into one question, Barbara, you got to take into account, okay, well, who's he writing to? Are they in Jerusalem or outside of Jerusalem? If they're outside of Jerusalem, then where? Were they in another Jewish part of town where Hebrew was prevalent, or were they in a Greek part of town that didn't use Hebrew regularly, and they didn't know Hebrew themselves, and so maybe that's why they said, well, maybe they knew the Greek, so maybe that's why Paul used Greek or the writer used Greek. So there's a lot of questions there.
Yeah, it just makes more. You have to live back there to understand it.
Could be in Bethlehem, Galilee, or...
Yeah, and we'll get into this in just a second, as soon as we get done with this. But there's, as far as maybe where whoever the author was writing somewhere from a distant place, so that could have had something to do with it as well. But that was another point of emphasis. Now another point of evidence for this is that Paul wrote this, is that few others would have had the background to compose such a book with heavy allusions to Exodus and Leviticus. And we just kind of talked about that briefly. The fact that Paul had such an extensive Jewish background, being brought up and trained like that, of course he would have known, being a Pharisee, he would have had to have known. He would have been able to get around that at all. Another point of evidence is that at the very last of the book, the very closing section bears somewhat of a resemblance to Paul's other letters where he's bearing some concern. But again, I would say, why all of a sudden, why switch it up? Why add a conclusion when you always added an introduction as well? So in the case of Hebrews, there is no introduction, that's normal to Paul, but then he adds one at the end. That makes no sense. It's just not in line with the way that Paul wrote. And we have 15 other letters that he wrote. There's just something different about this letter in the way that he wrote it.
Yeah, I just feel the pain, and I think sometimes when you're in pain, you just don't think or write or exactly like you do in a normal condition.
Well, you got to think he wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon while he was in prison the first time, and then he also wrote 2 Timothy. which was his last letter.
And you could feel the pain in that.
Yes, but he still wrote it with an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So he, even though under the different circumstances, when he wrote as a free man traveling, when he was in prison under house arrest, or when he was under strict confinement, he wrote his letters the same in every environment he was in. Now, in regards to that last one, here's some things that are common with the endings of his letters. He requested prayer on his behalf, which is one of the things we see common. He desired a good conscience. We see that. And he identified the Father as the God of peace. So we see that quite frequently. So there are some similarities there. And he pronounced a benediction of grace. So those are things very common. Now, there are some, this last piece of evidence, there are some who suggest that Peter's allusion to Paul's writings in 2 Peter chapter 3, 15 through 16, includes a specific reference to Hebrews. Now that is a matter of opinion and speculation. Now here's something that I will say, as far as being, I think there's more evidence to suggest that Paul did not write this than there is that he did. However, I'm not going to say that Paul did not have influence, because Paul traveled extensively. And so the fact that there are similarities, this leads us to the date. The date of this book is dated around 64 to 68 AD, which that would have been around the time that Paul wrote his last letter. All right. Now, during those travels, it is believed that Paul wrote his first letter towards the end of the 40s AD. So anywhere between 46 and 49 AD. So by the time this letter ended, his first letter had already been out over 20 years. And so you have all the Old Testament stuff there, all these different things. So other people could have read his letters, many of them. Several of his letters could have been read and passed around during all this time, during these 20 years that he wrote letters. They could have been passed around, and people oftentimes will write based on people that they read a lot, or people that that they like, or that they're influenced by, or are studying under, being mentored by, things like that. There are a lot of things that will influence people. So whoever this writer is could have been heavily influenced by the Apostle Paul himself, or through Paul's writings.
They didn't want to suffer copyright printed back then, so they took, like, they took what they had heard and read,
Yeah.
and they put a little bit of their twist on it to make it theirs.
But, and with that same point, we've talked about the pseudepigrapha. There was a lot of that being written. They didn't mind, these people, they didn't mind copyrighting somebody else's name and writing their opinions, whether they were wrong or not. They didn't mind copying. So if this was somebody like that, then, they wouldn't have mind sticking Paul's name on it, whether he wrote it or not. So, that's a good point, that you made there. To me, that tells me it's more genuine, because somebody could have just slapped Paul's name on there. But a lot of the early church, they contend that they don't know who actually wrote this, even though they lived a lot closer to that time. Now, there are people who speculate, and that's what that paper I gave you, that's what that's for, because it tells you that some of the ideas of the early church fathers of who they thought wrote it. And there's a couple, I think there's at least one early church father who someone had thought may have written this letter. But they don't quite match up with the date, because they didn't live during that time. As far as the time frame in which this was written, you can kind of gauge as far as the time frame. We know that it was written towards the end of somewhere toward the end of Paul's life. Do that thing, guy. I could tell. I couldn't hear it no more. I hope it'll pick me up on that. I guess somebody will just have to turn it up louder if they listen to it. One of the things about dating this book is the fact that it keeps alluding to the Old Testament sacrificial system and how the new covenant under Jesus is better and greater than the old covenant system. And part of the background of this book is the author writing to a group of people who are looking to find comfort in an old system of familiar ways. And that's pretty, I mean, you can pick that up pretty easily. But they were being persecuted. Now, if someone is writing this and they keep including all these sacrificial rituals and all of these things that refer to the Old Covenant, it would have more than likely had to have been written prior to 70 AD, because a few years prior to that, you really start to see this war being raged against the Romans by the Jewish people. And then in 70 AD, General Titus rode into Jerusalem and completely destroyed the temple. He leveled it. And the fact that the temple is not standing today is a result of what Titus did. And as a result of him destroying the temple in 70 AD, which Jesus predicted, remember, in that destroying of that temple, he decimated the city, tore down the city walls. There was many thousands of Jews that were murdered during this time. And the sacrificial system ceased to exist, by and large, after 70 AD. So if this letter was written after 70 AD, then, you know, it's not sure exactly why they were writing about that to the Jewish people, because the Jewish people were not really doing this. Because the temple was destroyed. Now, they may have been doing it other places, but the temple was the primary place where all of these things took place. And so there's a lot of historical evidence that the way that Jews did things simply just stopped. And so to me, that's like, it's kind of crazy, isn't it? For a group of people to be doing things a certain way for thousands of years and then all of a sudden stop. So, you know, this is historic, you know, to me, this is, you can take that this is reliable historical information that also backs up what the Bible tells us.
God's plan.
So, you know, because of that information, that's why scholarly consensus is that this book was written prior to 70 AD. Because there's no mention of the destruction of the temple. There's no mention of the cease of the sacrificial elements that the people were trying to revert back to. So those things are missing.
How are the Jews atoning for their sins? Because the Bible tells us all these sacrifices they're supposed to do and goes into specifics about how it's to be done. And they have accepted Jesus Christ, who takes away the sins of those who do know Him as our Lord and Savior. How do they atone for their sins?
Well, I think there were some who were trying to get by. You know, there may have been some who, in some of the, there may have been some synagogues that existed. We know that there were a lot of churches built on top of synagogues. I mean, archaeology has uncovered that. So, you know, I think one of the things is that they may have retreated and may have been doing some of these things privately, or in some smaller communities where the Roman legions didn't focus their attacks on the Jews. Because you got to remember, the Jews were leading a revolt against the Romans. And the Romans had warned them to stop, and they wouldn't. And so the Romans came in, as I said, under Titus, and completely wiped them out. And not just there, they didn't stop in Jerusalem. They also went down to Masada, where y'all were. You know, one of Herod's.
Right on the Dead Sea.
One of Herod's palaces that was built on top of the mountain there in Masada, overlooking the Dead Sea. Well, there were a lot of Jews who were up there that got pushed off the side of that thing.
Yeah, that's pretty
And
good.
so there were many thousands of Jews who I said, you know, who were killed during this time. So the fact that the Romans were attacking Jewish communities, and not just, you know, it wasn't just the men, it wasn't just the army, they were attacking men, women, and children.
Well, that was Caesar.
So, well, Caesar was a title.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Caesar was a title. I'm trying
So you're saying Caesar 1, 2, 3?
Yeah, they had different.
Something like
They had
that.
different. Caesar was more of a title, but they had names attached to it.
Yeah, okay.
I'm trying to think who was the emperor at that time. I know Nero was there until I think maybe around 60 something, before he took his own life. And I can't remember the other ones. I know that under. I know that when General Titus, I think General Titus's father was actually the emperor, or whoever, at that time. But I know that they were very ruthless against the Jews during that time period. So, you know, the fact that the temple was destroyed, and in fact they were chasing Jews all the way down from there to Jerusalem, down to Masada. You know, that's a good little clip. You know, it's not just a stone throw away, it's a few miles from Jerusalem to Masada. The fact that they were chasing them that far in other parts of the country tells me that they probably destroyed a lot of synagogues along the way too. So that would have stopped, you know, a community of getting together and doing the sacrificial systems to atone for sin. They may have had to do them privately in their own home.
That's one of those, there's a lot of, down along the Dead Sea, you can see a lot of caves and stuff. And people, well, that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found.
Well, there were communities that lived out there that were outside.
I mean, people lived in them caves.
Yeah, so, there were,
Anywhere, you know,
Well,
they could get out of the weather.
well, the Essenes, they lived out there for a couple centuries. And that's who a lot of times is credited with keeping the Old Testament scrolls, copying the Old Testament scrolls, as well as also copying, you know, that's how we know a lot about how the time frame was, what people did during that era, because, you know, we don't have a ton of information about some of that stuff, but because of them we do.
They were smart people. They said they had some way to lift that water up on top of that mountain and float ships up there.
Well, they had a, as far as getting water, you know, like drinking water, they had built an aqueduct system, because Israel has these things, they're called, basically it's just a dry riverbed, or dry creek bed, and they're called wadis. And you can find these, they're all over Israel. But these people had figured out how to build an aqueduct from basically one of these wadis, because whenever it rains, you know, it doesn't soak into the ground because it's so hard. And so they figured out how to tap into one of these, so every time they get one of these wadis, it would come in and it would wash, you know, from the upper part, it would wash down all the way down there so they could get fresh water. Pretty interesting how they did this.
Well, that wouldn't have nothing to do with the Jordan, would it? I mean, the Jordan was up there somewhere.
Well, the Jordan,
It flowed into the Dead Sea.
Well, the Jordan flows into the Dead Sea.
Right.
The
But
Jordan
it
River's
could
not
be
that big though.
Tributaries off, I mean, Jordan's not big, it's as wide as this room right here.
Yeah.
But,
In a
it
lot of
could be-
places, not even this wide.
Oh, no. But, especially up above Jerusalem, it's real clear. But you get down around, especially in the Jordan, and into Jordan, it's real muddy. That's where they said Jesus got baptized, down in that part of the country.
I don't know, a lot of times whenever they would reference the Jordan, what part of the Jordan?
Well, it flows right through Israel.
Yeah, but, I mean, it could have been done in one of the tributaries. It didn't, because, I mean, it's called the Jordan River Valley.
Yes.
So when he says he was baptized in the Jordan, what part of the Jordan was he baptized in?
Well, that was a valley down in there.
No,
And
the
they-
whole
and
thing
they
is.
went- It was a spring off the Jordan.
All right, so all the way up from north of the Sea of Galilee, all the way down through the Sea of Galilee, down the Jordan River, all the way through the Dead Sea, on south until it dumps out into the Red Sea.
Yeah.
That's the Jordan Rift Valley, that whole thing.
That's the Jordan Valley.
Yes. So when he says he was baptized in the Jordan, take your pick.
Well,
It doesn't mean he was
they
baptized
said,
in that one spot.
that one place, they said, had signs up that said, that the Pope's been down there, and,
I don't put a lot of trust in what the Pope says.
nah, but I'm just,
I mean, there's things in the Bible that gives us clues of where people were. And this is one of those things where we don't have a clue to tell us exactly where he was. Because if you follow John the Baptist, where he went, he traveled in a lot of places that Elijah went. There are 3 specific areas. Now, this is interesting. I know this is a side note, but since we're talking about it, there's an interesting side note is that there are 3 specific places that are mentioned that Elijah went to on the Jordan River. And, a couple of them are off in the tributaries where he went and was recorded. John the Baptist came in the spirit and power of Elijah. John the Baptist went to all 3 exact places that Elijah went to that are listed. I think that's pretty cool. And so we know some of the places that John the Baptist went, and so we know that Jesus went to one of the places where John the Baptist was. Now, where John was on the Jordan River or in the Jordan Valley, we don't know for sure. But I would say, based on historical information, biblical information, that John may have been one of these places. That Jesus may have been in one of these places where John was recorded to be. So, just a little side nugget there.
well, I mean, that's probably, it's strictly tourists,
Well, of course.
and they gotta tell you something.
Well, I mean, it ought to tell you something when somebody, buys a piece of toast and it looks like it's got Jesus on it and they sell it for $25,000. Hey, I got a $10 bill here. Jesus gave it to me personally. Anybody want to give me more than $10 for it?
In America, it ain't worth half that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is stuff, that, again, this is not, all this stuff is nothing salvation issue. It's all trivial. But it's information, I think, that helps us better understand the book.
But, just going to the Holy Land is incredible.
Oh, Yeah, well, I'd love to do it, maybe one of these days. But just to give you some quick, just a little bit of background. We've already covered a little bit of it. The fact that Paul or another author was writing to a group of people who seemed to be persecuted. And we know that when this letter was written, we know that persecution was kicking up. We may have a little bit of information that this may have possibly been written from the area of Italy. So what do we know is in Italy? Rome. That's where the Roman capital, that's where the eastern capital of the Roman Empire was located. Was in Rome. And we know that Paul was last in prison there. And we know that other Christians had been in prison there. We know that there was a Roman church there. Now, one of the people that thought may have written it was either Aquila or Priscilla. Now, Priscilla is actually a better argument than Aquila is, but most people will argue against that simply because she's a woman, and I don't see what that has anything to do with it. Because here's something else: when you read the books of the Bible that Paul wrote, and he mentions Priscilla and Aquila, the very first time that they meet, he addresses Aquila and Priscilla in that order, because that was common to address the leader of the home or the leader of the church, whoever it was first. If you notice, every time after that first appearance, look who is mentioned first in every case. It is Priscilla, not Aquila. So you need to keep that in mind. But she is a person who is in the category of someone who may have written the book of Hebrews. Now, I'm not saying she did. I'm just saying she's one of the many that are thrown into the hat. So she had some qualifications to write this.
Well, the woman at the well that Jesus, is talking about her husbands and everything, and, he's talking about the water of life lasts forever. She was the first evangelist, preacher.
I mean, could have been. I mean, she did go and tell everybody.
She went and,
she told them.
Inspired.
Yeah, she went and told them. So, that's a very, very good
So,
possibility.
my point was, the Lord uses women for teachers and preachers. And I've been in churches when I was a kid. Probably the only ones in the church was women.
Yeah. Well, I know that in most churches I've been to, if it hadn't been for women, the church would cease to exist, because the men wouldn't step up and serve.
The first one at the cross, and the last one at the tomb,
Yep, that's true. But I wanted to, basically the background of this book is summed up in a statement that I had read in a book. This was written by a woman, and Karen Jobes, and she's written several commentaries, and I really like her commentaries. But she was writing, kind of an overview of the General Epistles, and this is what she said about the book of Hebrews, and I think she summed it up pretty well as far as how the background of this book should be. She says, the author of Hebrews wants to explain to the readers how there is no turning back to the familiar ways of the Old Covenant that God made with ancient Israel now that Jesus Christ has come. That was then. This is now. The message from God that Jesus Christ is the full and final revelation of His relationship with humanity is relevant as much today as it was when originally written, regardless of who is reading it. I thought that was a great summary the background and major theme of the book of Hebrews. So, well, that's all we're going to get in today. We'll get into the rest of it next week. We'll go over the key themes, how to break the book down, and talk about the key verses. And also, next week, we did this a while back. We talked about the warning statements that are found in Hebrews. So I want to go over those next week as well, because those are an important part of this book. And I think that, I think this is where we can get into some of those discussions that we've had about whether or not you can lose your salvation or not. Because there's a lot of people who say that you can lose your salvation. They will quote a lot of these passages in Hebrews, but I think that they're missing some things when they read these, and they're not taking the full Bible into context, and we'll cover that as well. So, like I said, I wanted to take some time to go over Hebrews because it deserves it. It's a hard book to understand, but if you know some things, some background about the book of Hebrews, especially in regards to Exodus and Leviticus, when it talks about the tabernacle, it really puts things into a better perspective. So next week we'll jump into all that. We'll have a lot to cover next week, but appreciate you hanging out today. And any comments or anything?
Can I borrow your notes? You go too fast for me to write.
I will try my best next week to, I will print some of this out and I will hand them to y'all so that way y'all have it. Will that work?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. I told you if I was going too fast, just raise your hand and tell me to slow down.
Well, see, the problem is, though, is my brain will randomly go blank, and then I don't remember what I'm saying or writing. I blame it on medication.
I blame that on old age.
Well,
Me.
yeah,
Oh, you
yeah.
are,
I'm on, like,
Me.
I have to be on 200 milligrams of medication during the day, so.
All right, well, if there's no other comments, questions, Ronnie, would you close us out today?